Mishnah teaches that man was created with free will, and yet the Rebbeinu Shalom knows what's going to be before we do it. Seems to be a paradox, and it's in the category of those things that, as we have said recently, that we have an approach on how to live with the problem, directions, instructions on how to live with the problem. Sometimes you have an answer, a teretz. A teretz takes apart the problem of the kasha, the kushia, the difficulty, and finds that either there was missing data or an inability to calculate it correctly, and can do away with the misapprehension that caused the question. But sometimes we can't do that. If we can do that, we do that. Avram is confronted with an essential contradiction in the charge to bring Yitzchak as a sacrifice, and Yitzchak has not had children. Avram has been promised that Yitzchak will be the beginning of his progeny, which will be the Jewish nation, but Avram functions on two levels, and we've discussed that, many of us, recently, but just focus on one point, is that after the Akedah, Avram says, after he's bound him, told not to sacrifice him, he's told not even to create a blemish. So Avram then, after he has now freed of the obligation to go through with the korban, with the sacrifice, then Avram, Rashi brings Chazal, says, now I want to understand this patent contradiction. He's going to be the beginning of the Jewish people, sacrifice him before he's had any children. How can the two propositions coexist? Rebbeinu Shalom answers Avram that he never profaned his dibur. He only said to bind him, not to sacrifice him. And then there's a discussion on why Avram assumed, as it were, that it meant to sacrifice him. We have the Briskerov, that once it assumes the valence of being a korban oila, it has to be taken to its halachic conclusion. Or do you say that it's in fact a chidush? Human sacrifice is not present anywhere, quite the contrary. It's railed against in the Torah, and it's only a chiddush here, and therefore maybe it only means if you only go as far as the chiddush takes you, just bind them. Whichever way, Avram afterwards wants to know, what's it nogeh? What's it relevant? Avram understands there's a mitzvah to fulfill your rational potential of understanding as much as you can, as long as it isn't contradicting the principles of Torah, the hermeneutic principles, that I'll have to postpone judgment, that perhaps I'm missing a step. Kal v'chomer, the Bnei Yissaschar brings, is the only one of the Yud Gimel Midas of the 13 hermeneutic principles that we find can be duplicated. Torah chukos v'lakro, because our reason should need reinforcement. It's to encourage us to know that. And yet we do have to employ the reason. Avraham is the one who comes to a recognition of the Creator through his reason. That is part of the irony that he himself is being asked and put into this situation. So, there are times when we can maximize the reason, and as we have tried to understand it in the past, there's nothing more eminently reasonable than to understand the limitations of our reason. But it does seem reasonable that if we today, survivors of COVID, survivors of Miron, of Karlin, of missiles, of marauding and terrorism in the streets, of passionate, obsessive anti-Semitism around the world. If the Rebbeinu Shalom is giving us life, each day that we have this life, this gift, it means that it's a gift that is being very, very laser-like focused, that there's something that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants of us. The Rebbeinu Shalom wants of us more Kiddush Hashem, more commitment to appreciating that there are times when we don't have the rational answers, and we live with an approach. That approach is that, like by free will and predestination, that I live within time. The Rebbeinu Shalom transcends time. He created time. It's a creation of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So he is not limited, contained by anything. Melech Ha'olam is koida. He cannot be contained. As Shlomo Melech says, how can he occupy a Beis Mikdash? He transcends all. The answer is that we don't have an answer. We have an approach on how to live with such problems. And that's part of our rational faculties, is to appreciate this differentiation. So, we mentioned the other day that we read in the Parsha that Manoach says to his wife, if we had a miraculous experience, the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to take us away. And his wife says, no. If the Rebbeinu Shalom is taking our worship, it means that he wants this of us to continue. And so, living in these pressing, stressing, difficult times, we look for handles. We have an approach on how to live with problems. Sometimes we have a rational answer. And where we can maximize the reason, we do so. There was a book that was popular when I was of college age, and then later continued. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. If you recollect, he, as a teenager, had been taken into the camps by the Nazis, Yamach Shemom, and given an ill-fitting jacket to further reduce his self-confidence, to demean him, as was their habit, the Nazis, Yamach Shemom. And he found sewn into the lining of this other Jews, some Jews' jacket, much too big for him. He found a copy of the Shema, and that helped him get through the years that he was in slave labor in the camps. Afterwards, he developed a theory of psychological therapy called logotherapy, is that meaning is what man needs. I knew somebody who was doing a doctorate under Frankl the years after the war, would commute from Canada to Vienna, and I asked them to ask Frankl, what does meaning mean? What's the meaning of meaning? And because if it doesn't transcend itself, then it's arbitrary, and it becomes very relativistic. You assign one thing, ascribe one thing, me another. Couldn't get an answer from Frankl. Recently, there was a book published that somebody was quoting his mentor that said that post-Holocaust, the Jews are freed of any kind of responsibility to adhere to their heritage, their tradition, and their sense of mission. It's strange. And yet this same person was committed to tikkun ha'olam, and that one should not be merely focused on one's own people, but the world. My question then is that meaning, or is it preening? Is it posturing? What does it mean, tikkun ha'olam? Why tikkun ha'olam? Who cares? What difference does it make? If you're living in a reductionist, relativist world, that Wittgenstein would put it that all we have is the words that we happen to put together from our community, from our society, that we have, by consensus, agreed to give them meaning, but we can't find some space outside of ourselves to put that ladder. The ladder's been kicked away. I say that, I submit that if we are yet committed to tikkun ha'olam, any of us, that it's impossible to ignore that it's a relentless, pressing drive for the Jew. The Rebbeinu Shem gives us clues that just like there's a uniqueness, a strangeness in the pursuit, in the relentless anti-Semitism that we are finding around us today. Chazal, long, long ago, anticipated it. It's halacha b'yadua that Leilam Sena Esav is Yaakov. If the DNA of that antipathy wasn't in place, then everything that is being formulated, all the events, current events, happenings, would not be interpolated within that spiral. It's the protein of anti-Semitism was in place to begin with. And the Muslim energy, extremist Muslim energy, when it's directed against Jews, finds a hospitable environment because it was there. Jews, Hitler, Yimach Shemai, said he's taking out in Mein Kampf, he says, I'm taking out after the Jews because they're the conscience of the world. In fact, Balak preceded him. Balak had it that Am Yotza Mitzrayim, people went out of Mitzrayim, V'chisa, saying, oh, they've covered the land, says the Sfas Emes. They changed our attitude towards the material universe. They say it's spirituality and you have to squeeze it for the sparks of sanctity that are there. So, in a very, very tragic and painful way, the irony is that the more they come after us, the more it's a confirmation of who we are and what we are. The more Jews relentlessly pursue Tikkun Olam. Why? Who cares? Because it's an absolute that's built into the nature of their neshama. The Malbim has it that it's the Rebbeinu Shalom implanted in the human soul an awareness that there's an absolute, that's the Rebbeinu Shalom, and that it's inescapable. And as we discussed, that man sometimes will own up to it, that he has to fulfill the mitzvah of tracing back to its source, the absolute, to the moment at Sinai, to the moment he learned with the Malach, to before his neshama came here. That's the mitzvah. But the precognitive state intuitively is knowing that there is an absolute. And so, if, as Manoach's wife says, yes, there was a COVID still plaguing certain portions of the world, but here in Eretz Yisrael, extraordinary providence has moved us quite beyond the situation of threat that al tiftach peh certain that many places in the world still are in. Chasdei Hashem. Can we trace some of the steps? Yeah, but no matter how much you trace the steps, you see hashgacha every step of the way. So, the Rebbeinu Shalom is giving us each day another opportunity for davening, for saying Tilim, for doing chesed, for doing mitzvahs, for learning Torah. If we are being given those opportunities, then we have what to focus on. And if we see confirmation from the irrational hostility that explodes and the collaborative complacency of so many so-called civilized nations out there, how can we interpret that in any reasonable way other than a fulfillment of halacha b'yadua? It's a halacha. It's a given. It's a reality that there's an antipathy towards the Jewish mission, towards the Torah mission, towards our contribution. Yes, coming back to Eretz Yisrael, it's a miracle. It's intolerable to those who thought we would never make it back. It was part of much Christian doctrine. It was surely the position of the Muslim world. It's not just this space. It's also who we are and what we are in this space. Coming back to this space confirms it. Coming week's Parsha, Shlach, we have the spies go out and speak Lashon Hara and Eretz Yisrael, give a bad report. The report, the Tzor Amor says that Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael are to be compared. Eretz Yisrael, just like one has to have an ava, a koved for the people of Am Yisrael, the land of Israel, is outside a chayim, it's a living reality, and it has to be treated as such. Perhaps it's a living reality because it has halacha. That which has halacha means that it has to be treated as a living entity. The parsha ends with mitzvah of tzitzis. Rav Meir Simcha says the mitzvah of tzitzis is the four-cornered garment, the strings hanging from each of the four corners are not really woven into the fabric of the garment. They seem to be raw material hanging there, the strings. They contribute nothing to the warmth or the aesthetics. They're just raw material. Says Rav Meir Simcha, it symbolizes the invitation of man to complete that which was left incomplete in the four corners of the world. Like when a Jew says, Vayechulu, he's considered a partner with the Rebbeinu Shalom in Maisa Breishis. When a Jew brings the halacha, the Maisa, la Suke Shmaisa Libed, he's a partner with the Kodesh Baruch Hu in bringing that Kiddush Hashem. So there's an astounding invitation for man to, when the world was created, when the Rebbeinu Shalom appears to Moshe Rabbeinu and reviews from creation up and through the Avos, the name of the Shin, the Daled, and the Yud, She'omar La'olam Dai. The Rebbeinu Shalom, for some reason in his infinite wisdom, left room for man to do his thing. Like Tonis Rofus is told that when he challenges why Bris Milah, if the Rebbeinu Shalom wanted man, Mohel should have created him that way, could have created him that way. Of course he could have, but he didn't, because he left room for man. Tzitzis is leaving room for man. And again, as Manoach's wife says, if the Rebbeinu Shalom is giving us room to do our thing, to bring our offerings, our davening, our chasodim, then there's cause there for optimism. What is the optimism? The optimism is that there's a significance to this moment, this space that I'm in, this space in time, and to make it meaningful. What is meaning? That it stands for something beyond itself. What is the something beyond itself? That it's in Torah, in the moment of transcendence, that we connect with the moment of transcendence, and that we in fact then can have a sense of elation, of simcha. What's the simcha? The simcha is that I have been appointed, allotted, and I'm expected to perform. Hashem needs my performance. Hashem doesn't need anything. But if I do, in fact, wake up in the morning and I say Modeh Ani, and I find that there are challenges in my day-to-day existence, but the Ribbon Shalom, why things happen, I don't know. No pretension to explaining the why. But I do know that it's preening, it's posturing to come to conclusions about something that is merely subjective and reductionist. If, however, you substitute Wittgenstein's ladder for Lahavdil Jacob's ladder, then you're connecting this earth with Shemayim. And that you are connecting the now with history. And you're connecting history with the future. You're projecting. I am not just preening. I have in fact given an anti-reductionist substance to all of the hostility, anger, and spleen that spills over from the hostile. And so, the ultimate complement, the ultimate connection to a genuine absolute, not an arbitrary, relativistic, reductionist substitution, but to the substance of touching, feeling, the reality of connecting to the absolute is another bracha, another davening, another act of chesed, another reconfirmation of the schus to be in Eretz Yisrael, the living land, with Am Yisrael, the living people that transcends and defies all of the norms that do in all other civilizations and histories. And as the so-called civilized nations of the world complacently, casually, spectators to all of the anger and hostility. Thank you, nations of the world, for reconfirming what Chazal has taught us. We prefer you don't. We prefer you get on board and get in line. But either way, we know who we are, and we know that the Ribbon Shalom has, providence has given us this opportunity, and we rejoice, Gilu Beroda, we rejoice in trembling at the invitation, at the potential, and there's a simcha within that spills over to everything we do. Yeshua's refuahs for Kol Achenu B'nai Yisrael, wherever they are, and Eretz Yisrael should be the makor, the source for the light of that simcha going forth.